In April of this year, the Boston Globe published a bombshell report about some deeply disturbing allegations involving Patrick Rose, the former head of the Boston Police Patrolmen's Association. The Globe revealed that the Boston Police Department, Rose's employer at the time, had filed a criminal complaint against him way back in 1995 for allegedly assaulting sexually a 12-year-old child. The case was dropped after the alleged victim recanted. But even though a subsequent internal investigation found that Rose was probably guilty, he stayed on the job, continued working with vulnerable children, and became head of his union. Now Rose is retired and facing trial, accused of sexually assaulting 6 minors. After the Globe broke that story, Acting Mayor Kim Janey said her administration would conduct a full review of Rose's case. And today, she released its findings.
Director Everett has identified the policies and procedures in place at that time of the Rose case and has issued recommendations to ensure this never happens again.
But if you were hoping for an in-depth accounting of how an accused child molester kept his job as a Boston police officer for decades, you may be disappointed. The report is just 5 pages long and focuses on general BPD policies as opposed to specific decisions made by key individuals, all of which raises some big questions like, will the public ever know the full story of how and why Rose kept his job? If not, how can people really rest assured something like this won't happen again? And finally, how will what we've learned and what we haven't affect Boston's mayoral race? Joining me to talk it all through are my colleague Saraya Wintersmith, who covers Boston City Hall for GBH News, and I'll call him my peer, Yawu Miller, the senior editor of the Bay State Banner. Thank you both for being here.
Hey, thanks for having us.
Saraya, let me start with you. This report has been in the making for 3 months. People have been waiting for it anxiously. Were they expecting to get, do you think, what they got today? A 5-page document that elided specifics and focused on sort of the macro picture?
Adam, I think it's hard to say depending on who you talk to. I know in the press corps, when Janey took questions at her conference this afternoon, all of us were wondering when we might know who knew what when. Those questions were not answered. I think to the administration's credit, they did say in that 5-page brief that the recommendations aren't new. In fact, they referenced multiple times the 1992 St. Clair report, saying had those recommendations been implemented from years ago, it may have even prevented what we're dealing with right now.
Yawu, let me ask if this is what you were expecting, because as I mentioned at the outset, talked about policies, as Saraya just mentioned, and I want to get into the St. Clair report in a moment, but did you think that there was going to be more discussion of how individuals in the Boston Police Department, maybe in Boston City Hall, for example, former Mayor Tom Menino, how they might have been involved with the situation?
I think, yes. I mean, I would have expected to see more in this report. However, the broad strokes of it are that, yeah, I mean, the police department, the commissioner, the mayor, that there's a level of complicity that stems from their failure to embrace the recommendations of the St. Clair Commission report. More broadly, there was a mindset that police did not have to be held accountable in the same way that we hold other public officials accountable.
Since the St. Clair report has come up a few times, I had it saved as a later question, but let's do a little history lesson right now for people who might need a refresher. What was, and each of you can take a crack at this, maybe we'll start with you, Yawu. What was the St. Clair Commission report, and why didn't its recommendations, when it comes to changing policing in Boston, why didn't they come to be reality?
In the wake of the Charles Stewart case, which was a case in which a man killed his wife and then blamed a black man who didn't exist, just made up made up a culprit. Police responded by stopping pretty much every black person in Boston between the age of 13 and 50, and massive civil rights violations by the police, which were standard at that time and arguably continue to this day. Stop and search, stopping people without probable cause. So in the wake of all this, after it came out that Charles Stewart had indeed murdered his own wife and that there was no, whoever they were looking for didn't exist, there was some soul searching in Boston. People, I think, recognized for a brief moment that the police had acted in a manner that was racist and that, with total disregard for, the rights of Black men in Boston. I can't underscore how many people were stopped and searched and treated roughly and, disrespected by police. In the wake of that, there's a feeling that, things have to change in the police department. They commissioned a report. James St. Clair, who's a prominent attorney, going back decades, he'd represented Richard Nixon and other, famous plaintiffs. He took this case up. He issues a report saying that I'd say the major finding is that Boston needs a independent civilian review board. Which was disregarded because it hasn't happened until almost 30 years.
It just
later.
happened, right? And so that report came out in 1992. Saraya, let me ask you about something that wasn't in the report. If I read it correctly, and tell me if I missed this, but there were references to the St. Clair Commission and proposals that were not implemented that should have been, maybe that now have been. But I don't recall the names of former Mayor Marty Walsh, former Mayor Tom Menino, or former Mayor Ray Flynn coming up at all. Certainly not, they weren't singled out as people who failed to make these changes. Am I remembering correctly? Were they mentioned at all?
You are remembering correctly. None of those names were mentioned specifically. The mayor actually stopped short of faulting the then police commissioner, Paul Evans, even though she pretty much said the police commissioner is the person who had the appropriate authority to take the step and terminate Rose. I think with the mayoral race kind of looming over everything that's happening right now, and Janey being a person who's campaigning for a full term, she's in a bit of a tricky place in that she probably doesn't want to alienate any of the people who liked any of the political figures that you just mentioned. And so I think it's very intentional and careful not to mention any of the names that you mentioned.
I'm glad you mentioned the political piece because it's important, even though the underlying issue is probably more important. They go hand in hand. Andrea Campbell, the Boston City Councilor who's running one of Janey's mayoral rivals, put out a statement, which I believe we have, a very tough statement saying essentially that the report was inadequate. I'm just going to read a bit of it. Campbell said, "The report released today does not provide any significant new insight. It's time for a real independent investigation led by the U.S. Attorney's Office to find out what really happened here and give residents the transparency and accountability they deserve." I love the recommendations that the report makes because they were originally mine. These were things I fought for when drafting legislation last year to create the Civilian Review Board. So Yawu, let me ask you, is it possible that the way this is shaken out so far creates a late pre-primary opening for Campbell to say to everyone who's going to be voting in Boston, hey, just a reminder, I'm the one in this race who's been talking about reforming the Boston police the longest, the most comprehensively, so really you should give me another look before you decide who you're going to vote for. Is this an opportunity for her?
It's an opportunity. I mean, it's also a very, very much a changed political environment now than it was, I think, even when she was making these recommendations. With the George Floyd protests and everything that's sort of contributed to this environment where people are now asking questions, why aren't cops being held accountable? I think that there's an opportunity for her, but it's also bigger than Campbell versus Janey right now.
One thing that I want to do before we wrap up, we've just got a couple minutes left. The report, I've been talking a lot about what it didn't include, but it did make some specific recommendations about changes that should be made in the way the BPD operates. I'd love to just touch on a couple of those before we wrap up here. Saraya, let's start with you if that's okay. What are maybe one or two big suggestions the report did contain?
Sure. So I think the two big ones that won't be up to the will of the council, which we know has had its struggles with Janey since she ascended to the acting mayor's office. But things that the Boston Police Department could implement immediately are the recommendation that within 48 hours of receiving a credible complaint, the Internal Affairs Division should begin in an investigation. And then secondly, that the Boston Police Commissioner draft what's called a discipline matrix, basically a chart that outlines the steps of discipline that would happen for specific offenses, and that he present that to the next arm of the OPAT office that's going to be crafted, the Civilian Review Board.
And I think that may have been what Andrea Campbell was in particular referring to, because I think she had proposed that disciplinary matrix idea when she first wrote this legislation. Am I right there?
It was proposed.
And it ended up not making it in. Yawu, any other big recommendations that we should highlight before we end?
I just want to point out that 48 hours, after a criminal complaint against a police officer, they have to start an investigation. I believe that was in the St. Clair Commission report. That was also a recommendation back in 1992. We're coming full circle here.
And just to underscore, that's what, 1992? I have to count on my fingers. We're talking 30 years ago, right? 30 years, yeah. These ideas have been kicking around. And so actually, we've got time for one more closing question. How likely is it, do you think, that these things will, in fact, become reality? Because it's very easy to throw out big ideas at all levels of government when something bad happens, and then the implementation is the tricky part, as you just said. Saraya, do you think we'll see these things come to pass?
That's a great question. If you talk to the mayor's office, I believe the sense there is that there is will this time around to implement the recommendations.
Yeah, but what do you say? Last word to you, for real.
We're in a different place than we were 29 years ago. The city is a lot more diverse. The electoral, people holding office are a lot more diverse. City council is majority people of color, and we'll probably have a black mayor or a mayor of color come the fall. So, I do think there's a much broader, much wider opening for change now than there was, in 1992.
All right, we got to leave it there. Yawu Miller and Saraya Wintersmith, thank you both for being here. Appreciate it.
Hey, thank you. Happy to do it.
Adam.